All right, let me run something by you that I hear homeowners say all the time when they are going to rent out their property for the very first time. People will say something like, I think I found a tenant, but I've never actually rented my house before, so I don't know what to do next. Then the questions will start flying off. Do I need an attorney? Do I need a property manager? What paperwork do I need? How do I collect rent? Or what application should I use? And before you know it, they've gone down the internet rabbit hole and they wind up more confused than they were when they started. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the most common rental application questions that new landlords ask and show you some of our systems and processes that we use to screen tenants and lease our rentals. Because honestly, most landlords overthink this and accidentally end up making the process way harder than it needs to be. The reason I wanted to make this video is because when you're renting your property out for the very first time, the application and screening process is where a lot of new landlords get stuck. So let's break it down step by step. And if you haven't met me before, I'm Leslie Duvernay, California-based realtor, investor, and landlord coach, and I have actually been in the real estate and property management space since about 2010. In that time, I have screened hundreds of tenants and helped multiple homeowners turn their properties into rentals and get their units rented fast without needing a property manager. One thing that I see over and over again is new landlords tend to overcomplicate the application process. They add tons of hoops to jump through. They interrogate people on the phone. They make it difficult to just tour the property. And then they sit there and wonder why their property is sitting vacant. So let's talk about the mindset shift that actually fixes that. This is a mindset shift that most new landlords never even think about. And it's one of the biggest things that we teach inside of our Lease Like a Boss playbook. Your rental property is a product and your tenants are your customers. Now that doesn't mean you don't screen people. You definitely still screen people, but it does mean that you run your rental like a business. And if you're making it extremely difficult for someone to even tour the property or apply, you're creating completely unnecessary friction in the process. I see landlords do this constantly. They're so focused on protecting themselves that they accidentally make their rental harder to rent. So let's go through some of these questions that I see most often, and these actually came from landlord Facebook groups. So this first question is, should I call employers and references? You're not going to do this right away. This is not the first step you do. This is one of the first mistakes that I see a lot of landlords make and where they can waste a lot of time. They get an application and then they immediately start calling employers, calling references. Slow down. There is a better way. The process should basically look like this. You're going to receive rental applications. Then you're going to take those rental applications and do your credit and your background reports. From there, you're then going to do your income verification, which would look like requiring bank statements or pay stubs or proof of income, however they're going to show that they can meet your qualification criteria. Then once all of that is in, you're going to decide if you need to do employer verifications. They're not always necessary. And after you do that, then you're going to jump into your landlord verification or your landlord reference and always try to go 2 to 3 landlords deep. Now, the reason this is not the first thing you're going to do in the process is because if you get the rental application and you do the screening in the background and they fail your test or fail your criteria, then there's no point in you wasting your time calling employers or calling references if they're not going to meet step 1 and step 2. And inside of our frameworks that we actually teach, we don't even do any of the verifications until we have literally everything for their application. So that means the rental application, the credit and background check is done, the income verification documents, and any other documents that we require for their rental application packet. Then we start to review and do our verifications. So if they can't even get in supplemental documents, then that applicant is off the table. Which this leads me into the next most common question. What rental application should I use? Now this question, probably out of all of the questions, comes up the most frequently. Now if you're a landlord in California, or even if you're in another state, your rental application should include identity verification, rental history, their employment information, income information, and then the consent to run the credit and the background check. Now, the most common options that landlords tend to use for a rental application would be something through the Apartment Owners Association. You can download their templates online, or you could get something from your realtor, like California Association of Realtors application, for example. Those are both paper applications that you would then print and have them fill out. Or the best use of your time is actually to use an online application tool from some kind of a landlord software. And no, that is not Zillow. Do not use the Zillow rental applications. They are not as thorough as some of the other platforms that you can use that are even free, or there's paid versions. But even if you use the free version, they're going to be more thorough than Zillow applications. And the rule on this is when you take in an application, you must have the section where they authorize for you to do the credit and the background screening. You'll also need that authorization often to do your landlord verifications if you want to verify their previous residencies. And if it is a big apartment building, oftentimes that is a definite requirement. If you call a large apartment building and you call to do a landlord verification, they're usually going to ask you for a form to be filled out, like a landlord verification form, plus the authorization for the screening and verification of their information. So the most important part is making sure that your application has that section where they sign to authorize your screening and verification. Now, the next most common question is, should I have written screening criteria? Experienced landlords almost always have written screening criteria before the property is even listed. And your criteria might include things like income being 2 to 3 times the monthly rent, your minimum credit score, your rental history requirements, your occupancy standards, which could be maybe there's 5 maximum occupants allowed, for example, the pet policy, any other specific criteria that applies to you and your property. So this matters because having written rental criteria keeps you consistent, it keeps you protected as a landlord, and you're able to screen faster because you already know what you're looking for. And written rental criteria actually fall into the fair housing category as well. So if you don't have written rental criteria, you could put yourself at risk of having a fair housing issue later on. So the number one rule is your written rental criteria or your screening criteria. This should be solidified before you even list your rental property. So another common question is, should applicants combine income? This problem actually gets solved before someone even applies for your property, but this question gets endlessly debated in landlord Facebook groups for whatever reason. It seems simple to me, but again, landlords tend to overcomplicate things. I don't know why. So the answer to this question is your rental criteria actually dictate how this gets handled. So before the application even is completed, they should know what the criteria is. For example, if your criteria says applicants must make 3 times the monthly rent, then you could put in there that applicants can either qualify individually or combined. There's one rule that should always apply to your rental, and that is if someone is 18 or older, all adults basically, they must apply if they are going to be living in the property. Now, there are some caveats to this. If there is an adult that has a, let's say, permanent disability and one of the other occupants is their full-time caretaker, that usually is one of the instances where that adult who has the disability does not apply. But in other instances, all adults age 18 plus, they must apply if they are going to be living in the property. Everybody gets screened and everybody signs the lease. This keeps your process consistent, documented, and compliant when it comes to fair housing. So to answer the question, should applicants combine income? Absolutely. If there's 2 adults living in the property, you would of course combine their income because they're both applying and they're both going to be living in the property. They're both going to sign the lease and they're both going to be financially responsible for paying the rent. So of course you would combine their income. The next common question, I see this one a lot and I have a very different opinion on this actual question. Should I pre-screen applicants before they apply? So very, very common question a lot of landlords ask. And this is where I see a lot of landlords make the process so much harder than it needs to be. A lot of landlords try to interrogate people over the phone before they even allow them to tour the property. They'll ask questions like, what's your credit score? How much money do you make? Where do you work? Do you have pets? Hammering in those questions before they can even tour the property. But here's the problem. Every conversation likely is different. Different questions, different answers, different decisions, and that can create a fair housing issue, especially if you're in California. So instead, the better system is to put your qualification directly into your listing description. That way, if applicants are, of course, reading your listing, they can pre-screen themselves before they even request information on the property. A second level to this is when you book showings with people, you can send the rental property flyer, which has your written criteria. The better system is to let the listing and the criteria do your pre-screening. And actually, quick question for you. If you're a landlord and you're watching this, what is the most confusing part of tenant screening for you literally right now? I read those and sometimes turn them into future videos. Now, when it comes to pre-screening, this question, since it comes up so often, I actually treat this process quite a bit different than some other people teach, and it's been very successful for our team and other landlords that we've helped. So I will drop down in the description our Vacancy Playbook, which goes through exactly how we handle pre-screening of applicants and sort of our process that we do to pre-screen people without interrogating them over the phone or getting tripped up on some kind of a fair housing issue. Check that out in the link below. Okay, so our next question that comes up is, what if a tenant says they have rental assistance? People ask things like, do I have to accept rental assistance programs? Does rental assistance change the screening? What if they say they applied for assistance? So the first thing to understand is there are different types of rental assistance. So there are temporary programs like the COVID rent relief program, but something like that applies after a tenant has already been placed in a property. It does not affect the screening process. Then there are housing vouchers like the Section 8 program or other city or state specific programs. So now in California, these programs for rent assistance or housing choice vouchers, Section 8, programs like that, if someone has a voucher or is part of one of those programs, you cannot require them to earn 3 times the full rent amount. You are going to evaluate their portion of the rent, not the government portion. So for example, the rent is $2,000 a month. The voucher covers $1,500. The difference for the tenant portion is $500. So then you're going to need them to qualify based on that $500. In California, source of income is a protected class under fair housing. So you cannot reject someone simply because they have a housing voucher or a part of a program. But you can still screen credit history, rental history, background checks, and previous landlord references. The main difference is really just how you calculate the income for your qualification. So the question was, what if a tenant says they have rental assistance? Rental assistance does not replace the screening. Your process still stays the same. They're going to submit their application. You'll run your screening reports, do your income verification, and then review all of that, of course, against your written rental criteria. The only adjustment to the process really is how you calculate the income if there is a voucher or housing assistance program being used to cover the rent. And inside of that income verification, most applicants who are affiliated with these programs have no problem showing proof that they are in the program, whether that be some kind of a housing choice voucher program, approval letter, and they even have a point of contact so you can do your verifications and make sure that it is legitimate. Here's the biggest mistake that I see most new landlords make. They overcomplicate the entire leasing process. They interrogate people before they even show up to the property. They create all these hoops just to apply, and they are operating from a place of fear. But once you shift your mindset and realize that your rental property is your product and tenants are your customers, the entire process gets so much simpler. Now, if you're a landlord and you have a vacancy coming up in the next 30 to 90 days, I created a landlord guide called the Vacancy Playbook, which walks you through the exact system that our team uses to price rentals, screen tenants, market our properties, and lease our rentals faster. I'll drop that link below in the description. So the last question that comes up is, do I need a property manager? Most new landlords think that they're going to need an attorney, they're going to need a property manager, and all of these complicated systems. But most single property landlords just need a proper lease, a screening process, and a rent collection system. So stop overthinking it. Your rental is a product, your tenants are your customers. Run it like a business, and as always, happy landlording.